Deborah Miller, the JCRC's Director of Maryland Government and Community Relations. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, NCJW, the National Council for Jewish Women, and of course, Hadassah. A couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and for accessibility, you can click on the button on the bottom of your screen for captions. In terms of the format, I'm going to begin with a few questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, and you can submit yours anytime in the Q&A box. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. My colleague, Rabbi Abby Shirofsky, the JCRC's Director of Intergroup Relations and Rabbi in Residence. She also currently serves as the Executive Council of the Rabbinical Assembly and the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington, and she's co-chair of the Montgomery County Faith Community Advisory Group. In short, Abby is incredibly busy working to educate everyone about Jews and Jewish identity, and also importantly, she creates allies between our communities. I'm also grateful to have with us Ariana Kelly, the Executive Director of the Maryland Commission for Women. Previously, as many of you know, Ariana served for 14 years in the Maryland legislature, first as a delegate and then as a senator, and I'm a little biased for my District 16 in Montgomery County. For decades, though, Ariana has been instrumental in championing legislation to advance women's rights, whether it's improving health care for women or working hard to put this constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom on the 2024 ballot, which is the reason we are all here. So before we get to Ariana and Rabbi Abby, I want to share my screen, or Nirma from our office, Madrano, is going to share screen so you can all see and read exactly what question number one is, because I think it's very important for us to understand what the proposed amendment is. So I'm just going to read it out loud, and so can all of you. The proposed amendment confirms an individual's fundamental right to reproductive freedom, including, but not limited to, the ability to make and effectuate decisions to prevent, continue, or end the individual's pregnancy, and provides the state may not directly or indirectly deny, burden, or abridge the right unless justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. So it is very clear, and I'm going to dive in first with Ariana, what this amendment states. And as we all know, words matter and language matters. And one thing that does jump out at me when we first read this question number one is it doesn't say the word abortion. So talk to us a little bit about this amendment and the language.
Oh, wow. I love your opening question, because this is, it's really timely, because the world has changed a lot since we started work on this constitutional amendment. So just by way of background, it takes a couple of years to do these things. And folks who've been around a while in Maryland, like I have, will remember we did a similar referendum that was not a constitutional amendment back in the early 90s. That campaign started in 1990 with legislation and wasn't passed by the voters until 1992. That was a statutory change that we were having the voters vote on to approve, specifically changes to our abortion law to codify the principles of Roe versus Wade. So voters already voted on that in Maryland. The constitutional amendment, is a higher level of protection for those statutory changes we made to make our laws aligned with the principles of Roe v. Wade in the 90s, right? So we changed the law to say, back in 1968, Maryland did have an abortion law. It was legal to access an abortion in Maryland as early as 1968. However, we had kind of like what you're hearing about in Alabama these days. You had to get the permission of a committee. You had to have it in a hospital, and it had to be with the permission of a committee, a panel that worked at the hospital. So it was very narrow, and it was really access only for people who were well connected, and it created all sorts of problems like we're hearing happening all across the country. So in 1991, we made sure that even if Roe was overturned, we would not go back to that law. But what we didn't do in 1991 was really add into the Constitution that this was a fundamental right. So what we wanted to do when we saw the Dobbs decision was coming, we wanted to make sure that this was protected at the constitutional level in Maryland, and that it wasn't just about abortion access, but rather about that broader construct that you read, which is reproductive freedom, right? The right to choose whether you're going to have a child, if you want to have access to contraception, if you want to carry a child to term and deliver, you should have all of those rights. And there's a reason for that. There's a history in Maryland of limiting those accesses, limiting access to contraception, and even limiting the access to choose to have a child. So we wanted to make sure that it was a broad protection at the constitutional level, which is why we have that language.
So very important to have it enshrined in the Constitution, right? And
correct. That this is going to put it in the Constitution instead of in the statute, and it's going to make sure we have access to abortion, but also contraception, IVF, and other things. You know, whatever you might not even imagine right now, they might be coming for. This is going to protect that.
And we'll get into a little bit. I think that how the legislation passed not only 30 years ago, but more recently, starting in 2021. I'll get into that in a bit, but I want to let Abby, Rabbi Abby, jump in here because we will be talking about Jewish law and why are we looking at this lens? Why it is so important for Jewish women and what it means to our community to have this enshrined in the Constitution. So what sort of I'm asking you as an ordained conservative rabbi, what does Jewish law say about this? So I don't know if you want to look at the Torah or the Talmud or your own brain
or all of them,
or that has absorbed all of this, but because there is an understanding, I think, that in Judaism, it's not only permitted to have an abortion, but it's almost required.
So I want to be careful on what that means. I think that when we say required, sometimes people tend to, there's always the fear of going too far in one direction or another. Mm-hmm. And it's important to understand what it means that Judaism values life and what life means to Jewish people and within the context of Jewish law. Now, I say all of this with the caveat that as Deb said, I am a rabbi, I am a conservative rabbi and conservative movement rather than making any sort of political ideology statement, and that Jews are not a monolith. And for every Jewish person, there will be several ideas that are and thoughts and opinions that are happening, and that by no means is this the official, am I speaking for any entity or movement or anything. However, I am sharing resources from a paper that was unanimously approved recently at the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, where rabbis Susan Grossman and Avram Reisner reiterated a lot of the important points that Jews hold when it comes to talking about reproductive freedoms and what it means to be pregnant and to decide to end or to terminate that pregnancy for whatever reason that may be. And yes, it does come down to what is life, when does life begin, and whose life are we talking about? And if we look at this a core text in Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 5, that the laws and the rules that are given to Bnei Yisrael, to the Jewish people, that the people should live by them, v'chai bachem, that it shouldn't be that we are doing this in a way to harm ourselves, but really to enrich and increase our lives. So what that means is in a situation where a pregnant person is carrying a fetus that is non-viable, a fetus that is a pregnancy that is at a point where it is not going to continue as a safe or healthy pregnancy. For whatever reason, mental health is included in that. A woman can terminate that pregnancy, and Judaism does look at, Rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud, the various rabbinic texts do look at what does termination mean up through later months. And while the least invasive procedure is always preferred, it's recognized that there are points in time when a woman may not have the ability to make a decision prior to, may not have the information about whether it's a defect or a loss of life in utero, may not have that information until a certain point in the pregnancy. And in those cases, termination may be necessary, as deemed by both medical professionals as well as religious decisors, because it can impact the ability for future pregnancies. This is not just about what's happening right now, but what's happening to a woman's body in an ongoing way. And if a woman's body, if the pregnant person's body is going to be irreparably damaged and harmed because they're carrying this pregnancy, that is not okay. That is not acceptable according to Jewish law.
I really appreciate your sort of broad look at this, and as always, your nuanced view. Ariana, I saw you shaking your head, I think, when Rabbi Abbe was speaking.
I was, because I wanted to kind of make that connection. I really appreciated what she was saying, because some of the data that we talk about, as we're at the Commission for Women, we are interested in reproductive healthcare and access to that, but we're also interested in a lot of other issues that impact women, children, and families. And I know that the JCRC in particular has really prioritized these issues as well. So we have data, and we have seen in states that limit access to abortion care, increased suicide rates, increased domestic violence, significantly increased domestic violence, including murder of pregnant women. An 11% increase in foster care placement is the data that's emerging. There's obviously, the new data is emerging every day, but there have been studies on states that had limitations in place before the Dobbs decision that were pretty severe, and that's where this data comes from. And huge increase in childhood poverty. So it's all of these issues that we're talking about that have to do with people's lives and ability to live their lives and have families and long-term health, not just the pregnancy in the moment.
Abby?
I agree.
Ariana, I do want to talk to you a little bit about, you talked about the referendum 30 years ago. I do also want to talk about how this legislation came to be, because if you can correct me, but I think it started in the Speaker's House, the House in 2021. And then finally there was some juggling or jockeying going on. It didn't just automatically happen until it finally got to Governor Westmore's desk, and he signed it last year. So could you go through some of that process? Because I think it's interesting for people to know the inner workings of the legislature. And I know you were instrumental in pushing this forward.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question, because I do think it's really helps if we talk about what happened legislatively, it really can help people understand why this is so important. So around late in 2021, there were conversations about where we are going if the Dobbs decision comes down, right? If Roe is overturned. And the legislature really wanted to be forward thinking about this. So we introduced two pieces of legislation in 2022. One was a continuation of a legislation that we had tried to consider earlier, but really just couldn't, there was not the political will there. And that's this referendum. Before it was clear the Dobbs decision was coming down, it was really hard to get people in the Senate, which is traditionally the more conservative chamber, interested in voting on this. And there's a reason for that. And it goes back to the conversations about the 1991 referendum. Back in 1990, when that was first considered, there was an 8-day filibuster in the Maryland Senate. And it was really traumatizing It was really politically contentious. It's important to note that the leaders of that campaign that lasted from 1990 to 1992 were Jewish women and some Jewish men, Sandy Rosenberg, who was extraordinary and is still in the legislature. But it was very contentious. And it traumatized the legislature in many ways. A lot of the 1991 elections, 1990 elections, many people lost their seats because they weren't voting the right way on this issue. And so there was a lot of political trauma. People were afraid. People suddenly changed their positions on issues they had not been supportive. They saw with the popular vote, 62% of Marylanders voted for that 1991 referendum. There was just a lot of tumult, and it resulted in the legislature being frozen for 30 years. For 30 years since the 1991 legislation, we didn't pass any legislation with the word abortion in it. It was a stalemate between the two sides. And so what had happened was healthcare changed a lot in that 30-year period. The way we deliver healthcare changed a lot. We used to have care largely provided by doctors. Now we have care provided by a lot of folks with prescriptive authority, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurse midwives. Medication abortion didn't even exist back then. The whole landscape of how abortion care as healthcare is delivered, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, didn't exist, right? All of these changes had happened in healthcare, but had not been applied to abortion policy, which we knew was a problem. So we wanted to pair a referendum elevating the protections to the constitutional level, which was very important because we had seen that the legislature was frozen and we couldn't count on statutory changes happening in the legislative process. And we also wanted to modernize our abortion law to be consistent with all the changes in healthcare that we had seen over the last 30 years. An increased focus on equity and understanding that people need to be able to pay for their healthcare in order for it to actually be accessible, right? And a recognition that advanced practice clinicians are really important for delivering healthcare. So we had two pieces of legislation in 2022. One was the referendum, which was sponsored by Speaker Jones. And one was the Abortion Care Access Act, which addressed all of these specific legislative issues. Required health insurance cover abortion care in Maryland, required Medicaid cover abortion care, just like private health insurance does, because equity is an issue, eliminates this physician-only restriction that says you have to be a doctor to provide access to abortion care, which really limited our number of providers. And very importantly, established a fund for training advanced practice clinicians so that if what we considered to be the worst happened, which was Roe v. Wade was overturned and a lot of states banned access to abortion, Maryland could continue to provide care for Marylanders and address the need of these folks coming in from out of state. So we wanted to prepare for that. Unfortunately, what happened in 2022 was we were able to pass the Access Act, the statutory changes, which was wonderful. But we didn't get out of the Senate the getting it on the ballot question, this question that we're dealing with today, until 2023. So I think there was still at that point a reticence. There was an understanding that having an abortion bill on the Senate floor takes up a lot of time. It causes a lot of fighting. And there was a prioritization made that changing the access law was the most important because it involved getting those clinicians trained, creating that training program and allowing our physician assistants and our nurse practitioners who are already delivering all sorts of other reproductive health care in Maryland to also deliver abortion care. So we prioritized that bill for the first year. And then when we came back in 2023, unfortunately, the Dobbs decision had already come down. And so there was a lot of pressure to make sure we got this constitutional amendment on the ballot, which would be in 2024. So I think it was a matter, if I were, you don't ever want to pick and choose, which is more important. They work together in tandem. That being said, since this was going to the ballot, it could have waited a year, whereas the Access Act couldn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, one question about that. So that was what was very important about that was to have the have funding attached to it. And it was $3.5 million, if I'm correct. But wasn't that the previous governor, Hogan, didn't he, you guys overrid his veto, is that correct?
Yeah, so there were two things that happened under Governor Hogan. The legislature passed the Access Act and the House, but not the Senate, passed the referendum bill. When we passed the Access Act, Governor Hogan did not sign it. He vetoed it. And when he vetoed it, it came back to the legislature that session, and we overrode the veto. However, there was language in the bill to provide the funding to train the clinicians, which was incredibly important because, again, there's a shortage of providers. People can't access care. We have all these qualified nurse practitioners and physician assistants who could do, a 2-day training and they can provide medication abortion, right? It's not that tough, but we need to get that training happening. Governor Hogan refused to release the funding from that during that fiscal year. So we had to wait until the new administration. When Governor Moore was inaugurated, on the first day he was inaugurated, he released that money. So that was very helpful in terms of getting the clinical training program built and up and running so that we can have more providers who want to be providing this care appropriately trained to provide the care. So that happened. And then in addition to that, of course, Governor Moore signed the referendum legislation.
First of all, thank you. So as you can see, Ariana is full of information, and Rabbi Abby has tremendous amount of thought through our Jewish lens. So please submit questions. You have them both here for the next half hour or so. So please submit your questions. I can keep going, but we would love to hear from everybody who is on this webinar.
I wanna actually just, there was something that Ariana was saying about sort of the timing on everything. So in looking through the Chuvo, the legal responsa within the conservative movement, as well as different resolutions. And I'm the co-chair of the resolutions committee for the Rabbinical Assembly. So it was very, there was a strong push last year to write a resolution that reiterated our original position. Again, like JCRC, Deb, I believe you said the JCRC's policy resolution policy paper on reproductive rights and abortion was from what year?
1973, and I was looking it up, and I actually had to. It's not on our website anymore. I had to go back into saved drives. So, but yes, from 1973. So we are a leader in this. Go on.
And the resolution that the Rabbinical Assembly, and I imagine several other Jewish organizations and movements are probably from, are from the 80s, the 90s, from these pivotal points in sort of reproductive freedom and reproductive rights history. And in fact, the two rabbis that wrote the paper that I was discussing earlier, they were the two most recent writers, and that was from the early 2000s. So there's a couple of years, there's about 2 decades of information that, yes, we're all sort of, as a society, both secular, legal, as well as Jewish, playing a little bit of catch up to see where our, what does our tradition say about medication and medication-assisted abortion, and that, yes, it is necessary at times, it is completely permissible, and how does that inform what we are advocating for? Like you said, Ariana, the need to train nurse practitioners and physician's assistants to be able to administer that medication. If you have Jewish communities that know how accepted this is and are able to look at legal, Jewish legal precedent, that helps us to be able to support measures like this, and helps our communities to be able to support measures like this, and helps educate our, Jewish communities in general. Someone should know that when they're taking medication, that this is completely acceptable. They're taking medication to, for the purpose of terminating a pregnancy, that this is completely acceptable according to Jewish law. And like you said, that wasn't a thing when these laws and the legislation was put together in the 90s. So we have a lot of writing to catch up with, a lot of things to make sure that we're codifying across across all sectors so that we're protecting our communities and our constituents. I see there are a couple of questions that have popped up, Deb.
Yeah, there are
If you
a
want to
couple
go
of,
through and see.
yeah, I see a few questions. I guess I can start at the top. Ariana, you see the language in the constitutional amendment does not address any specifics around abortion access. What will determine up to how many weeks abortion is permitted?
That's a great question. And the reason that's not in the constitutional amendment is because that shouldn't be prescripted in our constitution, right? Everything changes all the time in terms of healthcare. The way in Maryland we legislate around that, and this is not, again, just want to be really clear when we talk about healthcare policy, what we try to do is have principles that apply across different kinds of healthcare so that we're not stigmatizing abortion care and treating it differently from other kinds of healthcare. So the question I hear, which is obviously, it's a big question in this conversation. How far can you go in Maryland? What's the weeks limit? We don't actually regulate healthcare in Maryland that way for any type of healthcare procedure, right? We're not going to put in statute or in the Constitution that you can have an appendectomy if this and then that is happening in your body. Because we are not clinicians, we're politicians. Not me anymore, thank goodness. We'll talk about that later. But so what that means is that we're not going to put in the constitutional amendment, this is the number of weeks. What we have instead is obviously all of the clinicians who have the authority to provide abortion care have licensing boards, and they have standards of care that they apply. And that any clinician, in order to be licensed in the state of Maryland, has to comply with those standards of care. That's how we regulate in Maryland, everything around healthcare. The reason I'm not giving you a specific answer, and I can give you talk nitty gritty. We talked about this for hours on the House floor to get this bill passed, is that standard of care is evolving all the time, right? So it needs to be a living document. It can't be we're putting a number of weeks in the statute. That being said, in practice, what we have in Maryland is, the ability to regulate post-viability. What does viability mean? In one pregnancy, it means something very different from another pregnancy. Many of the stories that we're hearing that are beyond tragic, and I will tell you one that we heard about in Montgomery County at a press conference 2 weeks ago. We had a patient who came from Texas where they have a complete ban. She had a non-viable pregnancy, that she was pregnant, but the fetus was not viable under any clinician's determination. Instead of sending her for care, she was sent to hospice. We're trying to avoid situations like that by not putting a number in our statute, right? But that being said, generally speaking, what you see are providers in Maryland who are providing, up to, say, for your average healthy pregnancy, the viability standard tends to be around 23, 24 weeks, if that's helpful. But we're not going to put a number in there, because instead what we're going to have is rules that our clinicians, who are the ones providing healthcare, are making the determination as if it's a viable pregnancy or not, so that we can save people's lives.
Thank you, Ariana. There are a couple of questions that I can put together. Back to language, as we were sort of talking about at the top, regarding compelling state interest. So what does that mean, compelling state interest? Ariana.
So that's legislative language that we use to create that balance. So what it's saying is, you're not going to restrict this unless there's a really, really important reason that is equal or greater to this, right? And that is language that is used by courts for judges to determine. So that gives enough flexibility so that under certain circumstances, it's going to be regulated if it meets the standard as determined by a court.
And thank you. Rabbi Abby, there's a great question here that I think I've sort of asked you before. I'm curious about the specific quotes I can reference in Jewish text as a Jew when explaining why abortion is important to my faith, and any literature this person is asking that they can read to be more informed. So I love that question. And then I do also want to talk, after you answer this question, a little bit about religious freedom, right? We've been talking about reproductive freedom, but let's bring it out to people not infringing on other people's rights, particularly the Jewish community and other religious faiths. But
It's as if you read my mind, Deb.
okay.
We've worked together long enough that we get that. So actually I was looking to find what is a clear and concise, and here's the list of quotes that you can use to, I guess, ostensibly, shoot back at someone who's saying, well, this is why abortion is wrong. And I unfortunately do not have that list of verse and chapter quotes at my fingertips, and I was trying to find a good one because I saw the question pop up in the chat. I do highly recommend checking out the Rabbinical Assembly and the RAC, the Religious Action Center for the Reform Movement. They do have all kinds of resources on the Rabbinical Assembly. If you look at it's completely accessible to anyone. Their religious legal decisions and their true vote section has all kinds of papers, including the one that I've been citing. The RAC, the Religious Action Center, will have all kinds of information on this topic and is typically very searchable, user-friendly, and able to go through and find, what does Judaism say? I also recommend the site Exploring Judaism that will also have information and writing from a variety of people and voices on what does Judaism say about abortion, about things as not just abortion, but on family planning as a whole. One of the things that Ariana pointed out when we were preparing for this is not just about the right to terminate a pregnancy, but also the right to carry one, the right to, what does it mean to begin a pregnancy and make those decisions? So conversations about IVF and the status of embryos, conversations about various kinds of assisted reproductive technology, all of those things, because it's a continuum. It's not just one or the other. And I was having this conversation with a colleague, Allie Corman, who runs the Red Tent Fund. And one of the things that we were talking about was that this is, reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. Abortion is one part of it. And if we're looking at this, we have to look at this as an entire life cycle. And I wish I could claim that quote as my own, but it is hers because it is. And getting to your point about religious freedom, so many of the laws that we're seeing being passed do not take into account what it means to be a religious minority or the viewpoints of religious minorities. When we talk about religious liberty, and there are groups, specifically Christian groups, that like to throw around the term religious liberty, limiting abortion and limiting reproductive freedoms and IVF and all of these different healthcare measures are infringing on the religious liberty of Jews, because we have strong law, we have strong precedent, halachic Jewish legal precedent that says this is what you can and in some cases should do. If a woman's life is in danger because she's carrying that pregnancy, the horrible case that Ariana was talking about from Texas, there's not even a question that abortion was absolutely permissible to save that woman's life. And yet, as Jews, that would be completely denied, and it would be denied if that person was Jewish, it would be completely denying that person's religious liberty. Yet no one is crying about that. No one is talking about that. I shouldn't say that. There are people talking about that, and we need to make sure that their voices continue to be heard. The groups that are working, that have graciously co-sponsored this today, and CJW, Hadassah are working tirelessly, constantly to make sure that people remember that there is more than one religion in this country, and that as Jews, we have a voice here, and we have an important voice that we have to keep using to make sure that this can't be lost. This part of who we are as Jews absolutely cannot be lost, and we have a responsibility to ensure that others have access to healthcare for their own bodies as well.
Ariana.
Can I follow up on that? Because what the rabbi was saying reminded me of something that one of my former colleagues in the House said during the floor debate on this specific legislation. And her name's Ann Healy. She's a delegate from Prince George's County. And she, back in the 90s, was a no vote on all of these bills. She has strong personal convictions in her Catholic faith against abortion. However, she gave a very compelling speech on the floor about this referendum. And she said, this referendum is ensuring that I'm not imposing my religious views on the rest of the people in Maryland. And I'm voting yes for this reason. It was very powerful. And, especially for people who know her and understand how strong her religious convictions are on this issue, it was a very powerful point of saying, this is about religious freedom. It's about tolerance. It's about saying my beliefs don't have to be yours. And this is a state for all of us.
Maryland, thank you, Ariana. I think, there's since the Dobbs decision, I believe Maryland is one of 11 states that has put a referendum that's going to be we're all going to be voting for in those states. And I think since then, about 14 states have imposed restrictions on reproductive freedom, some outright bans. Maryland does seem to be like at the forefront, maybe not surprising to some people, but it has pushed, and you have helped push through other pieces of legislation. Can you talk a little bit about what was the bill? I'm just trying to think. I think it was called the Reproductive Health Care Act, making sure that Maryland
protection, yes,
was a safe haven. And prevented, if I have this right, patients and clinicians from being charged criminally. And I think that is also sort of speaks to, Abby, looking at this as broader issues that impact families. And I really want to give credit to our legislature and you for pushing through that. Can you talk about that bill also?
Yes, I will actually tell you that year, the first year of the Moore-Miller administration, we had a package of legislation, 4 bills. So the referendum was one of them. We had another piece of legislation, and I'm trying to remember all the sponsors. It was so many great people who cared about this, and I want to make sure they all get credit. But Stephanie Smith in the House, and me in the Senate. It was me with Senator Feldman in the Senate. Did a contraception access bill that ensures that not just contraception, reproductive health care access, that makes sure all of our 4-year campuses have a plan for making sure their students have access to contraception and abortion care as necessary. So that was a really big bill. And then we followed that up this year. Senator Kagan and Delegate Smith did that with 2-year colleges, community colleges, in terms of the contraception side. They don't have health clinics on site, so they don't need the abortion access, but we're making sure contraception access is available on all of our community colleges. The third bill, which is the one that you're talking about, was the one that dealt with all of the legal repercussions. So we had our, legal team on that. Senator Smith, who's the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, partnered with Delegate Nicole Williams, who is just a rock star champion out of Prince George's County on these issues. And they designed legislation that would make sure to give the strongest legal protections to 2 different groups of people, the clinicians in Maryland, but also the patients who are seeking care in Maryland. What we wanted to do was make sure that both the people who are working here, providing care, and also anybody who's coming in to receive care doesn't suffer from overreach from any states that are interested in getting access to their medical records and possibly prosecuting them in their own state. And then the 4th bill that sort of rounds out the package was championed by Delegate Sandy Rosenberg, who I mentioned earlier, who's been a champion on this for years and years, and Senator Shelley Heddleman, also a champion and co-chair of our Jewish Legislators Caucus, which deals with those really nitty-gritty IT, healthcare, medical records, privacy issues, which is really hard. And Maryland is in the leading edge of figuring out how to make sure that those medical records are safe and secure, and that people, particularly if people who are receiving abortion care become targets, that those records aren't available. So we did a lot of really great work to protect Marylanders and to make sure that it's not just an idea on paper, like that when you vote for that constitutional amendment, it's not just conceptual, right? It becomes real, that we're protecting people's rights.
I also want to talk a little bit about at the county level, because I know you were there. Montgomery County's Vice President, Kate Stewart, introduced a resolution that the county council unanimously passed, also for a resolution for reproductive freedom, and it was very important. And that day, I think it was last week or the week before, there were also some protests about this resolution. And I think it's very important, once again, going back to what we started this conversation about language, because there were reports that in that resolution, there was gender affirming being encouraged, gender affirming, what am I looking for? The word I'm looking for.
Gender affirming care.
Thank you. Gender affirming care, which was not in the resolution at all. So can you talk about that issue that also came up at the county council level? I was so surprised.
Well, and you will hear this about the referendum as well. So I'm glad that you raised this issue, because it's really important to just clarify for people, because this is an area where people are getting confused. And I want to choose my words carefully, because I have a legislative record. I am a strong supporter of ensuring that people have access to gender affirming care. That being said, this referendum is not related to that issue. The reason you will hear opponents of abortion access claim that it is because when you do polling and you say, should there be abortion access available in Maryland, it polls through the roof. When you ask the question about gender affirming care and you specifically tie it to access for minors, it does not poll as well. So opponents of access to abortion care are trying to conflate the issues on purpose, because they know that that issue of gender affirming care doesn't poll as well. And they know that the parents' rights concerns can get people extremely confused and upset. And that's what they're trying to create, is chaos around what the actual referendum does. So just to be really clear on a detailed policy level, so you've heard it from me, this question came up many, many times on the House floor. I defended this referendum on the House floor before I moved over to the Senate. And then I was on the phone with supporting Senator Don Guile, who defended this referendum on the Senate floor. So I had it twice, and we had this conversation twice. The way that, gender affirming care is a choice for adults. They make their own medical choices in the state of Maryland. That's a law that's not changing. This referendum does not relate to that at all. In terms of minors, again, the referendum does not relate to it, but the existing law in Maryland in terms of minors accessing gender affirming surgery, which was the particular thing that we were hearing about, minors can't consent to their own surgery in Maryland, period. There is a very narrow exception for birth control access that has been on the books for decades. That's not surgery, right? It's medical care, but not surgery. In terms of parental notice for abortion care, we have a system that has been in place since the 1991 law, but it does not include gender affirming care either. So I could tell you 10 different ways that this referendum actually has nothing to do with gender affirming care. But there will still be people out there telling you that it does, because they're trying to create chaos and scare people where they can. Because if they were to actually say what this referendum does, it says the government doesn't get to make your reproductive choices for you, it would pass with 80% of the vote.
Thank you for making sure we all understood the language and for clarifying. There's a question that came in. I just read an article that Maryland will have a shortage of about 15,000 nurses by 2036. Will there also be a doctor shortage? How does this affect family planning and abortion in the state of Maryland?
You want me
Ariana?
to go for that too? I feel bad, Abby.
No, I mean, this is your area. I what's interesting is how it comes up in, so Deb mentioned that I'm also part of the Faith Community Advisory Group for Montgomery County. And we just started having our discussion about the budgeting cycle for the county and how are we looking to allocate, or we don't get to allocate anything as an advisory group, but we get to make a series of recommendations to the county executive. And in all kinds of verbal gymnastics, because I was talking with a religiously diverse group, including Catholics, Latter-day Saints, Muslims, Jews, Baha'is, et cetera, Hindus, everyone, because we are the most diverse county in the United States. But so yes, yay. And being the most diverse county, we need to figure out a way to actually talk about this topic. So I managed to do some kind of gymnastics, never actually say the word abortion, which doesn't make me thrilled because I think that we should be able to say that. But talk about this need as a county and broader as a state for what happens when other states and other areas are denying access, and what is our responsibility as people of faith to be standing up and saying, we need to make sure that people are safe. We need to make sure that all people are safe, and the safety of a human being, a person who is, who is not able to receive care in one state and will be septic and die, is coming to Maryland because that's the first closest state that they can get to. That is putting a burden on our system that will be adding to our, our medical resources, the hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to plan for that. And as a faith community, we need to be able to lobby for that. And we need to be able to speak up and tell our elected officials, when you're crafting a budget, this is something that faith communities find important. And faith, the JCRC and the Jewish community, we speak up for a lot of things. We talk, we make sure that we're talking about security for houses of worship, not just Jewish houses of worship, but all faiths, especially faiths that are under, that become targeted for all kinds of bias. We need to make sure that we're standing up against food insecurity and making sure that people have homes to go to and are safe in those homes. And this is one of those pieces too. This is one of those advocacy pieces. I was thrilled to hear that the Maryland Social Action Committee that Deb helps lead, and I know that some of the leaders from that group are on here today. Hi, everyone. That they also decided to make this a focus priority for the year. It's a little redundant, I think. That reproductive rights and reproductive freedoms are a priority for what we're doing in this calendar year, this programming year, because this is a Jewish value that, while yes, we have access in Maryland, Maryland might be the only state that others have access as well. And it can't all, we need to make sure that we're providing for everyone. That's a Jewish concept. One of my favorite, reasons that I quote for why I do this work is a passage from the Talmud that talks about, and it's cited a couple times, and I believe the one I'm going to pull from is from Sanhedrin, that we do this work. We feed, we clothe, we bury the Jews and the non-Jews of our communities. Not, we do this for the sake of peace, and this is, for the greater good. We do this not just to benefit ourselves, but to benefit everyone, because a stronger, safer community really is better for everyone, and that has to include reproductive care.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Rabbi Abby. Every time I testify, whether at the county or state level, or submit written testimony, which for reproductive freedom, as Ariana referred to earlier, I must have submitted so much testimony in favor of this package of bills that you referred to, because it is a priority of the JCRC, and we've been a leader in the Jewish community for this. But I also, I do want to make sure that question, as the executive director of the Commission for Women, Ariana, if you could take, explain what the work that you're doing and how this is impacting family planning and what the state is doing.
I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate Rabbi Abby's kind of contextualizing this, because it sort of brings it home for why we do this, right? And as she was talking, I was thinking about the people of West Virginia, right, who have an abortion ban. And so when they're coming into Maryland, they are likely to be driving, and they need support from that one clinic out in Western Maryland, right? And so they see a lot of patients now from West Virginia. We actually had someone who was providing care in West Virginia move over the state border to provide care in Maryland. This is a passion work for so many people, and we need to support them. So the idea was really, the nursing shortage is extremely well known, and that's something we have been working from a policy perspective to address in many ways. There is also a physician shortage, particularly in certain areas, and that's why I'm talking about sort of the different regions of the state. One of the reasons the Abortion Care Access Act expanded, we got rid of that outdated, you have to be a doctor to provide this care, is because on all sorts of healthcare in many regions of the state, whether you're talking about the Eastern Shore, or you're talking about Western Maryland, or you're talking about Baltimore, it's city, there are people who, there are huge physician shortages. And that's one of the ways that we have addressed that is by ensuring that our advanced practice clinicians are what we say, practicing at the top of their scope. If they're trained to do something to provide care, and all forms of reproductive health care, advanced practice clinicians are trained to do, we want them providing that so that we don't see this huge impact from clinician shortages. So we have a policy framework that we've applied to other forms of healthcare that the Abortion Care Access Act now applies to abortion care. So that means while we do see these shortages, and they are something we are working to address, and they affect different regions differently, the Access Act is going to make sure that all of the clinicians in the state who are allowed to provide care, who are capable of providing care, trained to provide the care, can provide it. And we don't have stupid laws on the books that prevent that from happening. And then it invests in their training to make sure they can access that training with the state clinical training fund, which is ongoing. Every year we put the $3.5 million in so that we're constantly training those clinicians to provide access to abortion care. And then sorry, there was another the way the funding for paying for care works. This is really a critical component to the model that we were thinking of. So to Rabbi Abby's point, we have an obligation to people who need to come here. We as a state, we control the policies for people who live in our state. That is why, there are many reasons, but that is one reason why requiring insurance products in Maryland cover abortion care was in the Access Act, and why requiring Medicaid to cover abortion care was in the Access Act. If we can make sure that that equity issue around who can afford an abortion or not is, to the best of our ability, solved under our state law, that's going to free up more money for those nonprofit organizations that are paying for people to access abortion care to help people from other states. So just by controlling our state law, we're able to help people who are coming here. And I will just put this in there because I know it needs to be said. We are seeing extreme challenges in those nonprofit organizations. So the abortion funds that help people pay for their care, some weeks they run out of money on Tuesday of that week. So this is a real challenge. And to Rabbi Abby's point, we have to really think about our budgetary priorities when considering that.
Thank you. Excellent points.
I want to add one quick point about the states. I know there are people on here that not only from Maryland. Hi, Dad. He's in New Jersey. So the question may be, what can and should other states do? And that is something that was asked in the Q&A, and whether it's challenging laws based on religious freedom or whatever, but look and read your ballots, read your ballots, ask these questions. And also, if you know that you're in a state where, it seems like, oh, we're fine here, New Jersey, first, what does fine mean and what does it look like? But also, what are you doing and what can be done in those states, like in Maryland? Deb and I had a lot of conversation about this because her initial thought was, why do we need this in Maryland? And why is this, we know it will be okay. And yet we should go through the world as if, yes, it will be okay. And we should also prepare for when it's not okay for others. And also, we didn't think Dobbs would be overturned, and that's terrifying. And here we are. And we need to think about all of our states and that all of us, may be in at this point. What can we be doing to strengthen those that may be coming in from other states and strengthen the mechanisms within different states?
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi Abby. You took the words out of my mouth. I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to thank Ariana, because we are coming up on the end here. What I want to say really is go out and vote. I received my mail-in ballot, I think the day before yesterday. Early voting began yesterday through October 31st. So, please go out and vote, because these issues are important, and it is urgent here in Maryland, although I think Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1, but we've got to get you out there to vote. And I want to thank our partners, National Council for Jewish Women, that has really been urging this, and Hadassah. And I see, Ariana, did you want to say one last thing before I let everybody go?
I just wanted to make the point I love how Abby sets the stage, and I'm just going to nail it home with something really specific, which is this constitutional amendment is so important because it sends a message to the rest of the nation, right? It's sending a message. People are hearing us loud and clear. And also those providers who are providing this care, who are doing, take a moment of personal liberty, right? I grew up with an expression, it's God's work, right? Like, it's important work in many cases. And if we have it constitutionally protected, then they can move from West Virginia here to continue providing care. But if we don't have it constitutionally protected, it's much harder to figure out how to operate, because the clinicians from across the country who are figuring out how to continue how to do this work need to be in a place where they know we're not going to change our rules in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years. And they're, homeless again, they're transient. It is really hard. So if we're trying to build a sustainable future, the constitutional amendment is really, really important. Experts predict we're probably going to be in this situation for 20 years, that the impact of the Dobbs decision is not going to change in the states where people are suffering and dying for at least 20 years because of the way the political process works. So hopefully there is a light at the end of the tunnel where every state has access to this care, but for at least the next 2 decades, we have to figure out how to help.
Thank you. So I'm not coming from a rabbinical or a legislative point of view, but I will say that the Jewish community is supposed to be bringing light to the darkness. And we seem to be having to do that in many ways right now in our community. So thank you both, and thank everybody who was listening. And this is recorded, so please feel free to get some more information from jcouncil.org. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ariana. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks,